This episode on the Borderless Church, we're in Cairo, Egypt, home of the Nile, the Sphinx, and the Great Pyramids.
Yes, and also babies in baskets and homicidal water horses that are actual serial killers called hippos.
Stay tuned. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again on this episode of the Borderless Church. I'm your host, Brandon Jackson, where we're going to take a practical approach to missions, international missions, and hopefully learn some important and interesting things about some fascinating places in the process. Along with me, as always, is my good buddy and co-host, Brandon Edwards. Brandon, you guys having a good Labor Day out there?
We are. Everything's going great here. Everything's nice and warm outside. You can hear the cicadas, because it's the 17-year craziness. But everything's wonderful.
Excellent. How are you guys planning to spend the Labor Day? You gonna go take the kids to the park or do anything, cook out or anything like that?
We have a big little, one of those inflatable pools out back and everything. And I have a feeling the kids are already out there right now having fun. Because typically I can already hear the screams of somebody being sprayed in the face with the hose that's not happy. So, yes, it's a good family Labor Day.
Excellent. So last time we talked about Hong Kong. We were in the last episode, we were in Hong Kong, and we talked about the Sim Sha Sui neighborhood and where we would put a church. And you had a really interesting, idea about incorporating media into that. And again, one of my favorites, favorite ideas up to this point for obvious reasons. But you threw me a curveball. You going to throw me any curveballs this week?
We'll see. But one of the fun parts about doing that one last time around was because of thinking outside the box. People often forget that you can utilize different works and different talents and abilities to plant churches around the world, to plant churches around the globe.
Yep.
And we just kind of miss out on that at times. And so I wanted to get your actual genuine reaction, which is why I didn't share with you ahead of time what it was that I was going to say last time. So this time around, probably, I would say not necessarily more conventional, because nothing about what we really talk about is very conventional per se, outside of just go in, buy a church, start talking to people, that type of thing. But I think it will be something that it's a little bit media related in some ways, but you do have to think differently when you go into these different cultures and different places. And the one we're heading to today is very different.
So speaking of which, we're in Cairo, and I've never been. That is not a place that I have visited. You've spent some time there.
Yes.
First impressions of Cairo?
Oh, so Cairo is not just a fascinating city, but a historically relevant city. And I went there in my teens visiting, and then also again, I think when I was in college with my father with the overseas program, and so we had opportunity to visit there. I have incredible memories of being in Cairo, and it's one of those things that you often miss because it seems like it's just these postcard moments where you see the pyramids seem to be in the middle of nowhere, just completely isolated from everything else. There's nothing surrounding them except for they're there. Except for that's not necessarily how it is, because they have this one road, and this one road is here, and the pyramids are on one side, and nothing is built next to the pyramids on that one side, but the other side is built up the city all the way up until that road. And so I remember my first night there because we landed in the evening, and we went to our hotel, and I woke up the next morning, and you couldn't see anything in the dark. But when I woke up the next morning, I looked out the window, and the pyramids were there. And I remember going, where did they come from? Because they were not there last night when I got here. And it was just such an incredible experience to run into that. I still think about that memory when I was walking over to get breakfast at the hotel, and I walked out and I went, was that a pyramid out the window? And sure enough, there
another
was,
one.
right there. There was another one that was just staring
They're
at us
everywhere.
from a distance. So, Cairo, I have phenomenal memories of. I think a total of probably 16 days total spent in Cairo and then other parts of Egypt, taking a very slow. It's not really a cruise nearly as much as it's a very smaller boat that you go and you stay on, but it's for smaller groups, so 30, 40 people. You go up and down the Nile River and stop at many archaeological sites along the way. Just a fantastic place. Wonderful, caring people, some of which follow me on Facebook, even all these years later, that I connected with that worked on the boat or were translators for us while we were there, and tour guides. So just wonderful place.
So shout out to all your former contacts or contacts from from a long time ago in Egypt.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get going in to the discussion today. We are going to be in northern Egypt. Cairo is on the north central tip of Africa, near the Nile River Delta. It's about 75 miles west of the Suez Canal. Hot desert climate, lots and lots of sand. No surprises there. High temps around 72 degrees in the winter, 104 degrees in the summer, but it's a dry heat, right? So you don't feel it as much.
Yeah, like a hot air dryer.
Exactly. Population over 9 million, 21 million in the greater Cairo metro area. The capital is Cairo, the Egyptian capital, and it is the largest city in Egypt, sixth largest on Earth, and is the largest metropolitan area in the Arab world. It is the city of 1,000 minarets, as you can see right there. These are the Islamic towers, part of the landscape there as you look around Cairo and probably most of Egypt. But those minarets are a beautiful structural architecture. They speak Arabic, is the language that is spoken in Cairo and in Egypt. I found that the neighborhoods, that Cairo itself seems to be really designated by neighborhoods, more so maybe than, I'd say probably like New York or some of those really larger metro areas. And the neighborhoods are important because you've got a lot of different types and different for different purposes. You've got Old Cairo, which is the south of central Cairo, the original site of the city. You've got Coptic Cairo, which is kind of the home, I guess the base for the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria, which is a very old, I forget, kind of like how did you describe it? The original
it's
kind of Catholic
like
church?
Classical Christianity, classical early Christianity.
You've got Western Cairo, which has a more modern European-influenced architecture, wider streets. That's important because Islamic Cairo is the opposite. You got smaller lanes, lots of the Islamic architecture. Giza, which is a suburb of Cairo, obviously known for the pyramids. It's on the west bank of the Nile. And then New Cairo, which is the newly formed home to many international and English-speaking schools. And we'll talk a little bit more about New Cairo a little bit later. Early civilization, we're going way back here. This one and China were around from the very beginning. It seems like Cairo was officially established in 969 A.D. That's officially Cairo was established then, but you obviously have ancient Egypt, which dates back to about 3100 B.C. The Giza pyramids are a product of ancient Egypt. Memphis was the capital city of ancient Egypt. If we go into rulers and governments over the millennia, officially the Arabic name means conqueror or vanquisher. So you can tell that was a big part of what Cairo is. Cairo has had to work for its name all these years. Several Arab dynasties introduced caliphs or caliphs. Is it caliph or caliph? You might know a little better than I. Okay, caliph. So Arab dynasties created, and so you've got the Fatimid Empire, which ruled Egypt from the 10th through the 12th centuries. Then you've got probably one of the most well-known caliphs, which is Saladin. He was an advisor to the Fatimids, and then he became the first sultan of Egypt. He captured Jerusalem from the Crusaders and expanded Cairo. He built the Cairo Citadel in 1183 A.D., which became the seat of Egyptian government until the mid-19th century. Then you've got the Mamluks. The Mamluks were non-Muslim slave soldiers, and they actually seized control of Egypt and had some positive impacts on Cairo specifically. Further expansion of the city itself, new construction, and it became a center for Islamic scholarship and a crossroads for the spice trade route. By 1340, Cairo's population was around 500,000, making it the largest city west of China. Then the Ottoman Empire took over in 1517, and the spice trade shifted away from Cairo. This was a big deal. Obviously, it made Cairo's importance diminish significantly. British invasion and occupation from 1882 to 1956 moved away from the historic Islamic Cairo sections, and that's where you get the more European influence in architecture in certain neighborhoods, certain parts of Cairo. 5% of Cairo's population were European at that time, and most of those were in governmental positions. So there is a Western influence, especially in the late 19th century. All right, so we move on to transportation. Cairo does have a metro. It's one of only 2 metro systems in Africa. 4th and 5th metro cars are reserved for female travelers only. Women may travel in any car that they choose, but they've actually reserved the 4th and 5th metro cars for women. I found that interesting as I did some research. The monorail system, they actually have 2 trains under construction right now for a monorail system to connect Cairo's metro area. And then the first section should be finished. The first section of that monorail should be finished around 2022. We move into philosophy. It is the center. Cairo is the center for the region's political and cultural life. Philosophies are based on the Islamic influence of the city and the region, which includes respect, modesty, and honor. These are important if you're visiting Cairo, that you respect the Islamic, practices, and be aware of that. As far as economy goes, it is the largest non-oil-based GDP in the Arab world and accounts for 22% of Egypt's economy. The majority of Egyptian publishers, media outlets, and film studios are based in Cairo, and until recently, they suffered from hyper-urbanization, which basically meant they were growing faster than the city services allowed. So there is a lot of construction in Cairo, and that's going to lead us to our discussion a little bit later on too. So what is Cairo known for? Well, Cairo is known for what's called funerary art. This is artifacts created with an emphasis on the afterlife and burial art. Tombs, mummifications, masks, all this kind of stuff. Very little emphasis on individualism of the artist. It's all about usually the pharaohs and these kinds of people. Of course, the pyramids, the Giza Pyramids complex is the Great Pyramid, last standing wonder of the ancient world, was built 2600 to 2500, and it includes the Great Sphinx, and this is in the Giza necropolis. So these are some of the things that you would come across. Don't forget, the Egyptian Museum is the world's premier collection of Egyptian artifacts. So if you're a big fan of mummies, you can go check that one out. There's also the, and I'm going to screw this name up, the Pharaonic Village.
That works.
Think that was pretty close? Okay.
Pharaonic
Village. Demonstrations of it's kind of like that when you step back in time, whereas here in the States it'd be like, this is how we lived in the 1800s. Here it's like, this is how they lived when there were pharaohs around. So a little bit different. Demonstrations of how ancient Egyptians lived. Museums showcasing pyramids, mummification, and Egyptian history. So I thought that was pretty cool, and I'd totally pay a few bucks to go see the Pharaonic Village. All right, how about some
volunteers? Do they take volunteers for the mummification process? Or is that
like a giant roll of toilet paper? I always wanted to be a mummy for Halloween growing up, but we never could afford the amount of wrap that was going to be required. The medical
the
wrap.
Pandemic, when you guys stocked up, you could have made that come true.
Yes. Yeah, the toilet paper, absolutely. All right, some of the musts regarding Cairo. Cairo does have two theme parks, Dream Park and Magic Land. Now, I can't say for sure if they're both still opening. It's kind of a question as to whether they were, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, it might be fun to go visit. Take a night cruise on the Nile in a felucca. This is just a boat on the Nile. It's located in Garden City if you want to check that out. Go to an Awa coffee house. I think you can do other things at the coffee house that may involve tobacco, but we would just drink coffee, right? Horseback riding at the base of the pyramids. Now, I wouldn't do a horse, I'd do a camel, but you could do either one. Try some kushari, which is rice, macaroni, lentils, chickpeas, and tomato sauce. Looks pretty good to me. Fatir is pancakes or pitas with fillings. They could be sweet or they could be salty. I'd probably go with the sweet. I'm a big fan of crepes, and that sounds like crepes to me. Of course, falafel and shawarma. These are very popular, especially street foods in Cairo and in Egypt in general. So, I actually discovered falafel in the last couple of years, and I'm a big fan. I never had tried it before that. And,
well, I'm hungry now, man. That food looks incredible.
And shawarma
really
is just
good.
like shawarma is just a gyro, right? Gyro.
There you go. You got it right. After all the
Nailed
videos, you got it right. Finally.
So I could totally do that. Totally do shawarma. So
Yeah.
all right. So now we're going to transition into discussion about the church plant itself. So what can you tell me about location and your ideas for Cairo?
So for Cairo, one of the key things I wanted to focus in on was actually New City. Which is New Cairo, and the main reason for that is not only because of its Western influence, that it has already this idea of kind of this new build, these new places coming in, Western influence, Western ideals. You're also going to find a lot of Western universities, so places where you can actually get connected in. You're seeing some phenomenal visions here of what they have planned for New Cairo as it grows. So the influence of Westernization would kind of match a little bit with allowing for different ideals. One of the key things I've often said is when you go into a place that has such a rich history of religion, of faith, you need to make sure that you're not coming across as antagonistic or against something. So if you can be in an area where it makes sense, especially one where maybe you can get a job at the University of Cairo, the American University there, you can teach, you can be part of helping build that culture, that new place that's there. It's a fascinating prospect. So New Cairo is kind of the area, but beyond that, one of the key things I really wanted to focus in on was from not just my own personal experience, but also my experience with those who are in the Islamic faith that I have grown very close with through the years, is in the same way that many of them would claim that I have at times a very misrepresentation about Islam, that I oftentimes have found myself misrepresenting it, not knowing that I was doing that, but just taking what I had learned from different things along the way, media sources, whatever it may have been, about Islam that weren't necessarily true. Well, I found the same to be true about Christianity. And so one of the key things that I thought would be an interesting part of planting a church in New Cairo is, number one, I wouldn't focus on a building. I wouldn't focus on a location. I would focus on doing it in a home. Very much like you would in a place like China and the rest, not because you have government oppression, but because you want to be culturally sensitive. You want to understand that Islam is the predominant faith. It is that, and there can be cultural and personal repercussions for leaving the Islamic faith. And so with that in mind, offering a very private studies, private premise of house churches, I believe would probably be the best way to have an inroads in a place like that. So one of the misconceptions that I've found about some of my Islamic friends have shared with me about Christianity is they view Christianity as something less adherent. You're not as engaged in the personal practices of your faith in comparison to Islam. And one of the reasons and examples they would often give me is the call to prayer. So 5 times a day when I was in Cairo, you would hear the entire city in essence stop, as over the very loud speakers you would hear the call to prayer. Everybody would stop, and typically you would bow towards Mecca or Medina, whichever way was the closest in that scenario, and they would bow down to pray. So a neat way of actually kind of countering that narrative, this narrative that Christianity on the whole is not as adherent, doesn't have as many of those things, is creating a social media campaign or even a way for people, maybe it's even a website and the rest online that's tied to you as an individual working there, you as a church in some way, and simply say, here's the simplicity of Christianity. And what would be really fascinating is if you created it to where you posted 5 times a day. So it kind of matched the premise that there's this understanding of, I'm trying to make sure that there's something available that you see on. So on this time in the morning, we're going to talk about prayer. And here's what Christianity actually teaches about Jesus. Here's who Jesus really is. And here in this afternoon time is where this is who God really is. And this is who the Holy Spirit really is. And so you can create an educational campaign away from the misconceptions that people have about Christianity, and also engage with what is already an accepted practice, this idea of 5 times a day stopping and focusing on God, which I think is a beautiful practice in and of itself. And so by mimicking that in some ways, and then elevating the understanding also, the basic simplicity of Christianity in an educational format, sharing it online, and then inviting people, hey, if you have any more questions, come talk to me. That making that a non-confrontational evangelism is really what it is. Because more than anything, you're just educating them about Christianity or about Jesus or about faith and prayer that can be applied even in their daily lives where they are. But it breaks down barriers of misconceptions. And to me, that would be a key component of how I would look to plant a church in New Cairo. Not just because of all the Western people that will be there, so you might have some connections there, but also because it's one of the fastest growing regions of Cairo. It has a massive upgrowth and possibilities, and there is a lot of technology and education that's built into that. So all of those tie into this idea of a house church plant that's focused on educating people through the local social media without being confrontational, without being antagonistic towards the faith, but instead embracing some of the practices that are actually healthy practices of going through and consistently remembering God a certain amount of times a day and engaging with people in conversation through that. So that's kind of my idea of what I would do if I were to plant a church, but never expect to go to a place like Cairo and have a church grow quickly. It's going to take time because you have to unteach, deteach, almost like at an onion. You have to take away layers of religion and culture and history to get to oftentimes what is truth.
And it can be done. We've seen it. We've definitely seen it in the work in Greece with a lot of the refugees that have been coming through. But another thing. This is not an easy. This will not be an easy job. But at the same time, it's not impossible either. It's not like the underground church in China, and we kind of talked a little bit about that. There's a difference between a state-sponsored religion versus no religion, and the government is the religion, right?
Correct. So government oppression is not something you would necessarily face in a place like Egypt, in a place like Cairo. Cultural pressure is what you'd face there. Cultural pressure associated with historical other faiths, religions, and the rest. And that's no different than what you would find elsewhere, except for, and I mean this truly and honestly, devoutly adherent followers of Islam are very culturally ingrained. It's very much, you cannot separate faith from culture in some of these notions, especially in Islamic countries. It is ingrained with very much the identity of who you are is ingrained with your religious faith. That is not a Western ideal nearly as much as it used to be. Now we separate things, especially in America. It's, church and state are always separated. Whereas that is not the case in many of these Islamic countries, historically Islamic nations.
Yeah. So this one, it's a little different. Certainly, I would say I wouldn't say you. It's not impossible, but you would have your work cut out for you. And but this one, you start slow. This is not a traditional brick and mortar.
Sure.
We're going to set up a church and invite people to come. This is done on a much more of a one-to-one, or like you pointed out, using social media to reach out. But I love the thought of taking something that is predominantly Islamic and converting it, because there's nothing wrong with that. What if we had what if we stopped what we were doing 5 times a day and spent that time in prayer or scripture or whatever. And I think it's a great thought.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, one of the key things with all of this, especially when it comes to missions, is you never think about the larger numbers. And I've often said that numbers mean nothing except for they mean two things. They mean people and they mean souls. And so if you were to go and spend 10 years in Cairo and you only influence one person, that's worth it. That's worth it. I mean, that's just the reality of it, is that soul is priceless in that. But the
Yeah.
idea that that one person would never influence somebody else, you just may never
Yeah.
see the impact of what happens from there. And so we are such time-driven individuals who are so myopic in our long-term view of how God can influence places and cultures and times that we miss the impact of just the one. In fact, when I worked in China, my prayer consistently was, and I remember the moment when my father was talking to me. I said, God, I haven't really talked much with, and this was to my dad specifically. I said, I haven't really, talked with people recently about Jesus. It's just kind of felt like things have died out. And he said, well, have you prayed for them? And I said, well, I pray all the time. And I said, he goes, no, no, no. Have you specifically prayed for one or two or 12, or say, God, help me to engage with these individuals? What was amazing about that is that as you start to pray for God, give me a conversation with one person, that your
Mm-hmm.
mindset changes when you start to have a conversation with somebody. Then is God working in this moment? Is God bring forth this person at that time? And so you think differently than going forward when you've actually asked for one or for two or for 12 or for 20, whatever it may be, to have an influence. And I also remind people all the time that Jesus had 12 close people, 12 close disciples, three of which you could count as very close and dear friends, and the whole world changed from them. The whole world changed because they took it in a very hard place where people were dying because of that belief, and took it. And we are living representation of what happens when people share the gospel, even in the hard places.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that leads us to the engaging question for this week. What are some common misrepresentations about Christianity that you've encountered? So we talked about this certainly from an Islamic standpoint. We have misrepresentations of other faiths and other religions, but the flip side of that is absolutely true as well. And you mentioned kind of sometimes Christianity can come across as hypocritical, can come across as less devoted, and they're not always wrong with that. That is certainly something that there seems to be a convenience level with a lot of people's spirituality and Christianity, I think.
Sure, and I'll say one of the biggest misconceptions that I love to share with my Islamic friends is that Christianity is not a Western religion. Christianity is not an American thing. It's not, it's not a national thing of anything. Christianity is not tied to one specific place and one specific time. It is a global premise, a global ideology, a global, real, true faith based off the ideals of truth. But it's not a Western concept. And this is also where I understand where that premise comes from, because we often love to couch our Christianity, in those terms, in those ways. We love to make it Westernized. And I'll share one of my favorite memories of a dear friend who was an Italian who came over to the States and walked into one of the church buildings and saw that we had pews and went, "Oh, you've been influenced by the Catholics. You have pews." I remember going, "What does the pews have to do with the Catholics? Like, how does that work?" Well, that was just in his mentality. Catholic churches have pews. So then I stopped and thought about it. I was like, well, most of the churches I knew in Italy that were Churches of Christ didn't have pews. I just didn't realize that was the reason why, at least in his mindset. So we all have these preconceived notions, these misconceptions about Christianity or about even other faiths. And the question is it true? Is it real?
Mm-hmm.
And if you can break down those barriers, you can get to the kernel of truth that is within it all.
Absolutely. All right, good stuff. Next episode, next time, we're speaking of the West, we're moving west significantly, and we're heading to Argentina. Yes.
Nice.
Buenos Aires.
Very
Buenos
cool.
Aires. In another place I know nothing about. But I've got
I've
a
never
month
been
to
there either,
learn.
so this will be new. I know enough about the soccer to remember. Man, I could make some British people mad just by saying the hand of God, the hand of God goal that happened in the World Cup. Some of the most phenomenal soccer players of all time: Diego Maradona, Lionel Messi. Who's Lionel Messi's to a point now where he's even in rap songs in American culture. That's how big he's gotten.
Hey,
Just
I know him,
fascinating.
and I don't know anything about soccer. So yeah, that tells you something right there.
Well, there you go. And so I'm. This will be fun because I've never been to Argentina, but I have many friends and many soccer players that I played with through the years that are from Argentina. Fantastic culture, fascinating place. Looking forward to seeing what we can come up with on how to plant a church in Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Awesome. Ought to be fun. So mark your calendars for October 4th, as we'll
Not a
be
word.
talking about Argent Firth. It's Colin Firth. That's a last name. So, all right, that's all the time we have for this month's episode. For my co-host Brandon Edwards, I'm Brandon Jackson. Thanks for joining us, and I guess we'll be seeing you in October in Argentina.
Bye, guys.